Hi, my name is Osei Bonsu, Senior Curator International Art at Tate Modern,
Hi, I'm Bilal Akkouche, Assistant Curator of International Art at Tate Modern.
and we're co-curators of Nigerian Modernism. So Nigerian modernism traces the development of modern art in Nigeria throughout the 20th century, focusing on the artists who really pioneered the development of modern art, who've created art schools, clubs, societies, groups that have all in different ways contributed towards the transformation of art in Nigeria. So the first room of the exhibition is titled Figuring Modernity, and it kind of deals with the importance of figuration and the figure in relation to what it means for artists to intervene within this idea of what modernism is. Modernism is more often associated with development of art in Europe, but in fact there were many artists in Nigeria who were pioneering figures in changing the way that we think about modern art, and I think with that we'll focus on some examples in this room that are really outstanding. So maybe the first example we can look at is this image of Charlotte Obesa titled Sisi Nurse. It's a work by Aina Onabolu, one of the first Nigerian artists to really transform, you could say, arts education in Nigeria, and he insisted on this idea of academic portraiture as a kind of means to modernize art in Nigeria. And he believed that through the acquisition of kind of the skills associated with easel painting, Nigerian artists could actually be in dialogue with their European counterparts. So he trained at St. John's Wood College here in London, but also in Paris, and actually acquired some extraordinary skills that he then used to encourage other artists. And I think what's important is that these are portraits of Nigerians commissioned by Nigerians, and I think some of the first of their kind. I don't know whether, Bilal, you want to add anything?
I can take
Yep.
you over to the next artist that we can spotlight, who is Aina Onabolu, who was trained under Aina Onabolu and utilized some of the similar techniques, but really focused on sort of Yoruba folktales. So here you can see a series of paintings that speak to these indigenous traditions, utilizing the same sort of techniques.
And these span about a 50-year period. So he was an artist that was extremely prolific in his time, and actually he was in dialogue with other forms of art being made at the time. So whether it was figural wooden sculptures being made by figures like Justice Okorodelu, or the great Yoruba carving traditions associated with the Oluwe of Ise. This is a carved door from 1910 that records an encounter between a British colonial officer and a Nigerian king. There is a kind of extraordinary breadth of vision in this room that speaks to the multi-directional nature of Nigerian art in the early 20th century. So we're now going to move to the next room focused on the artist Ben Nwonwu. So this is a room dedicated to the pioneering African artist Ben Nwonwu. He was an artist born in Onitsha in 1917, and in fact, because his career sort of straddled the colonial and post-colonial period, he's somewhat of a complex and contradictory figure within the emergence of modern Nigerian art. He was an artist who became associated with many elite circles here in the UK, where he was commissioned to create the famous portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, which is also featured through a large exhibition graphic in the back there. But I think more significantly, he was an artist who was constantly grappling with what it meant to have received a classical European arts education as a student at the Slade College of Art, while embracing his indigenous traditions and traditions associated with Onitsha Masquerade, the town that he grew up in. And what's fascinating is through his depiction of both female and male Igbo masquerades, he was able to really inspire these ideas of negritude and Pan-Africanism that were kind of widespread in the 1940s and became very much closely associated with historical figures like Leopold Sedar Senghor, who founded the concept of negritude. So as we move down this room, we see an extraordinary array of images that kind of speak to his interest in cultural festivals, that speak to the kind of cross-religious and multi-ethnic character of Nigerian life. And these are made across a 50-year span. I don't know whether, Bilal, you want to point out any highlights that speak to you.
Yeah, a personal favorite of mine is the Durbar Ovid festival that he made in 1955, and here you can really see a site of celebration. Yeah. We'd also love to spotlight the the Daily Mirror sculptures that were loaned from Access Bank.
Yeah, absolutely.
And these are a highlight of the exhibition and a centerpiece, and we're really excited to to be including them.
And these are really modern masterpieces. I mean, they were initially created as a commission for the famed UK newspaper, the Daily Mirror, to kind of decorate their offices in part, but they've become these kind of iconic symbols of the acquisition of knowledge, ideas associated with power and transcendence. And actually, if you look carefully at these men who all appear to be reading newspapers, they almost look like angels kind of ascending. And I think there's something very evocative about the way in which one will use sculpture to embed himself within Igbo traditions, within traditions associated with his father, and the use of the adze, which is an indigenous carving tool, but constantly synthesizing different forms and techniques. And I think as a figure that emerged actually on the eve of independence, he became, I think, associated with everything that artists could achieve, but actually he was somewhat of an exception. He was one of the few artists that actually managed to build an international career, becoming one of the premier African modernists, you could say, at a time where artists were still struggling under colonial rule to define their own visions. And I think Nwamu, for that reason, is celebrated within this exhibition through a vast array of works, but certainly is just one among many important Nigerian artists that we wanted to spotlight. We're now going to move on to the next room, focused on the ceramicist Ladi Kwali. So as you'll see as you enter this room, it's a very focused spotlight on an outstanding figure within the development of modern Nigerian art, Ladi Kwali, who was trained as a ceramicist at the PTC, the Pottery Training Center in Abuja. And actually the color that we've used for this particular room is associated with the color of sort of traditional terracotta pots. And through this process of kind of high-fired ceramic techniques, Ladi Kwali was able to synthesize the European techniques imported by the Pottery Training Center and the traditional Gwari techniques that were pioneered by women over generations. So she's known for her ceramics, most of which are water pots, casserole dishes, beer mugs, in which she incises sort of spiritual emblems or signs that have to do with traditional Gwari knowledge systems. So you can see the lizard, you see various kind of bugs, and the idea is ultimately that Ladi Kwali was more than just a ceramicist. She was an artist that was developing her own original take on ceramics that I think transcended this idea of utilitarian objects. And it's known, in fact, that some of her ceramics were so large in scale that they actually kind of they were more of an expression of her own personal artistic endeavor than they were utilitarian objects. So when we often think about ceramics, we think about it in relation to a very gendered idea of art. And it's important within this exhibition that we spotlight that we spotlit a woman artist who's engaged in a very important cultural endeavor that should be recognized in the same light as painting and sculpture, and that ceramics are no different. They reflect a real sense of artistic ambition and integrity. I don't know whether you want to say anything else about that.
No, just to say that we really wanted to spotlight her as a woman artist, that has become a household name.
Absolutely.
And just showcase her alongside painting, sculpture, and take her out of this idea of domesticity and utilitarian objects, and really present her as a fine artist amongst her peers.
Yeah, and some of the material in this vitrine, for example, spotlights some of the demonstrations that she led at historically black colleges throughout the US, where she was effectively showing Gwari techniques to an African diasporic audience. So Ladi Kwali's kind of sort of example transcended Nigeria. She was in fact perceived as a national figure, but also a figure that represented, I think, a kind of an important example of what women in Nigeria were doing at the time. And I think we can't understate the significance of her work within this exhibition. So this room is probably one of the most dynamic and multifaceted in the exhibition, and it's a room that's really dedicated to the kind of elaboration of artistic forms that emerged during the period of independence. The title of this room is actually New Art, New Nation, and that comes from a manifesto written by the artist Uche Okeke, who declared that Nigeria needed a new art for a new nation, and that it was important that young Nigerians take on this challenge of crafting a new kind of art. An art that was at once celebratory of indigenous cultures, but also cognizant of many of the European traditions that had been imported through the education system. What's fascinating about the Zaria Art Society is that they formed as a student society in the first instance, but they became some of the leading figures anywhere in the nation. So many of them spread out after graduating from NCAS, the Nigerian College of Art, Science and Technology, to teach in various parts of Nigeria. And their legacy is as important in the pedagogy from a pedagogical standpoint as it is from an artistic one, that these were really educators, the first of which is Clara Ogbodagangu, who actually trained at Chelsea College of Art here in London and then went back to Nigeria to teach, and was actually not only the first female teacher, but the only Nigerian teaching at the Nigerian College of Art, Science and Technology. And she ended up inspiring many male artists who would go on to receive more critical visibility and success. But it was so important that we open with works by Clara Ogbodaga. And then there are many other examples across this wall that speak to the kind of various sort of expressions that were emerging during this period, where artists were embracing Pan-African ideas, they were embracing ideas of a multi-religious, multi-ethnic society. And I think this particular work that Bilal can speak to kind of captures so much of this multi-ethnic and multi-religious aspect of Nigerian culture, where you have artists who may have been born into one religion, who are actually creating images that honor different forms of religious practice.
Yeah, so this is a favorite of ours, and it's made by Uche Okeke. It's called Juma from 1961, and it depicts a group of men leaving the mosque after Friday Juma prayer. And what's fascinating about this room specifically is that there are artists grappling with ideas around post-coloniality and this idea of a new nation, nationhood, belonging. But there are also artists the same artists are also depicting daily life, daily ritual, what it means to be a human, and things like that. Another favorite of ours is Fulani Horseman from Jimoh Okolo, by Jimoh Okolo. And Jimoh Okolo is an amazing artist. In this work, he's depicting Fulani horsemen from the north of Nigeria, the Islamic majority area of Nigeria. This work was first shown in his 1964 Commonwealth Institute exhibition held in London. Yeah. And it could be the first time since then in an institutional capacity that it's been shown in London again. So we're really excited to show this work.
Commonwealth was one of those rare spaces in London where Black artists, Asian artists were given some of their first opportunities to present their work as an extension of the cultural diplomacy associated with the Commonwealth. But what's so key about Jimoh Okolo is that he was a figure that refused to be associated with the Zaria Art Society, partly because he wanted to be seen as an individual artist. And that idea of independence extends well beyond the kind of political idea of national independence. It's also associated with artists who were grappling with what it meant to belong to a sense of nationhood, but also to a community. And I think Jimoh Okolo is fascinating in the sense that he's one of those figures whose works are maybe more explicitly directed towards northern representations of Nigerian life, so Fulani and Hausa people, as is reflected in this image of Fulani horsemen who were known for being associated with the spread of Islam throughout northern Nigeria. So it's a real historic work that's captured in kind of bold, abstract form and kind of speaks to this idea of natural synthesis for which the Zaria Art Society was so celebrated. So we're now going to move to another room dedicated to the city of Lagos. So as you enter this room, you might hear the faint sound of high life music, which is a musical genre developed in the 1950s and 60s, very much led by artists who were synthesizing forms of traditional West African music together with music from Latin America and from Europe, but really music that was played at nightclubs throughout Lagos at the time. Many of these artists were directly impacted by high life music and were interested in high life as a model of kind of cultural hybridity. But also what's happening in parallel is you have the transformation of the Lagos skyline. So actually on this wall, we actually show a kind of vista of buildings from across Lagos that are associated with tropical modernism, which was a style of architecture very much born out of the synthesis of the conditions of the tropical climate of Nigeria and the modernist principles or the international style associated with many European modernist architectural schools at the time. And it's through this kind of synthesized through these forms of synthesizing artistic languages that you really see Lagos transform during this period to become a real hub, not only for economic development, but as a space in which artists are almost coming together to create new forms of art, new forms of cultural expression. And I would say that the sculptures in this room are very fascinating. They're by artists who are mostly based in Lagos during this time, not necessarily associated with major art schools, but who were trained primarily through Nigeria's Royal Sculpture Guilds. So you have figures like Ahama Omokpai, Beno Sawi, Okpu Eze, all of whom were kind of thinking about how to assimilate a kind of international modernist style, very much in response to global trends and global conversations, and who were really kind of leading the charge in terms of bringing contemporary Nigerian art to a kind of widespread audience. Many of them received commissions to create murals and create sculptural reliefs for public buildings all over Lagos, some of which still exist to this day.
Yeah, you can see an Amokpai mural here.
Exactly. This is an
It seems
extraordinary
to-
example. And this actually still stands today. This is a relief created by the artist and sculptor Felix Idabo, which sits at the base of Independence House, that was commissioned to inaugurate the independence celebrations in 1960. So there are many important narratives being carried through this particular part of the exhibition. And I think we're now going to move through to a section dedicated to the Oshogbo School. So this is a room that we're particularly excited about. It brings together a selection of artists associated with the Oshogbo School, which was a school that emerged again in the 1960s in parallel with what was happening at the Zaria, within the Zaria Art Society and at NCAST. But more specifically associated with artists who had not received formal academic training. So many of these artists were individuals who were very much invested in Yoruba culture and in Yoruba spirituality, and had actually come to art through the insistence of Duro Ladipo, an extraordinary Nigerian dramatist and performer who had encouraged artists to take up theatre and drama as a way of expressing deeply held belief systems of Yoruba religion. And I think what's significant about Duro Ladipo and his kind of network is that they were transdisciplinary. They were artists working across theatre, textile, poetry, sort of forms of printmaking. And I think this is all captured within this room titled Festival of the Gods. It's titled Festival of the Gods because to this very day in Oshogbo, you have many important cultural and religious festivals, including the Ogungun Festival, the Festival of Oshun, that remain very important sites of spiritual pilgrimage for the Yoruba people. And I think there are so many examples that we could point to in this particular room, but I would like to focus specifically on this work by Mama Nike Davis, as she's lovingly known. Mama Nike is an artist who's probably best known for her pioneering use of Adire textiles and batiks. And these are traditions associated with the Yoruba culture. But by the time that Mama Nike had began working in the 1960s, she was interested in using textiles as a way to provide opportunities for social mobility, particularly for women. And she was fascinated in this idea that through textile, women could tell their own stories, but they could also gain access to new opportunities, new financial opportunities. And she set up a center specifically to support that endeavor. And in this particular image, we see the powerful symbol of the goddess Oshun that kind of sits at the center of this room as a powerful spiritual figure. And the goddess of Oshun is, of course, known to many people who live in Oshogbo as the kind of deity that to whom an important shrine is dedicated at the Oshun Oshogbo Groves. And in and amongst these shrines that were revived in the 1960s by the New Sacred Art movement, you have this real spiritual power and this sense of spiritual calling that many of the artists in this exhibition are speaking to, but specifically in this room, it's about the kind of revival of Yoruba spiritual reliefs through visual art. And many of these stories would have been passed down through oral traditions, but seldom were they visualized. And I think what these artists did is they brought new visual form to many mythological and folkloric tales of Yoruba religion. And I think it's why they remain such a celebrated group of artists in Nigeria to this very day. I don't know whether there's anything you'd like to highlight from this particular room, Bilal.
Well, just to add that it was a beautiful coincidence that we positioned Jimo Baramo, Nike Davis Okunde, and Moriana Oliemi, because they were all here for the opening on this morning.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was just wonderful to see them all together.
Absolutely.
And they were so happy and just over the moon with the representation of their work. And one thing we've really tried to do is represent artists in depth. So instead of one work per artist, we've tried to do at least 2 or 3 to showcase the breadth of their work. And we're really excited that they were able to make it.
Absolutely. And I would say that almost every artist in this room is speaking to a different narrative. One of the things that we're really excited about is this idea that it might encourage people who maybe have not themselves received a formal arts education, but are inspired by this idea that many of these artists were working, for instance, on hardboard. They were producing textiles, working with textiles sourced from the local market. And it's that kind of commitment to storytelling that I think separates the Oshogbo School from many of their counterparts, but also this real idea that in Nigeria during this period, and this of course is before the period of the Civil War, you had this cross-pollination of artistic influence. So Georgina Bayer, who is a British artist teaching at the Oshogbo School at the time, had influenced many of these artists, but also the African-American painter Jacob Lawrence, figures like Melangatana, the Mozambican painter, had all traveled to Oshogbo to lead workshops. And what you're seeing is the kind of result of all of that cultural cross-pollination and a real investment in sharing knowledge and sharing information. And I think that's what makes this particular room so resonant, is that it celebrates the various ways in which artists created community within this period.
I think we're also really excited to see what comes out of this presentation in terms of PhDs or further exhibitions, because there's so much research to be done. For example, we came across this wonderful work by Twin 77 called Condemning Witchcraft, Red Skulls, which is held at the Senate House Library, University of London. And yeah, just an amazing work, and there just needs to be so much more kind of research and yeah, into all of these artists and works.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should say that many of the Yoruba artists associated with the Oshogbo School were interested in extending personal mythologies, but they were also interested in the fiction of writers like Amos Tutuola, whose famous novel, The Palm Wine Drunkard, inspired many of the images you're seeing in this room. So lots of references to fantastical realism, and this kind of coalescence of the spiritual world and the world of the living was very much a feature of their work. And I think one of the reasons that the Oshogbo School is so unique is that they were not afraid to delve into folklore and into areas of Nigerian spiritual life that until that point had been challenged by the proliferation of Christianity, and specifically the kind of the ways in which you could say Nigeria had in some instances lost contact with these traditional forms of religious practice. We're now going to move to one of the final rooms in the exhibition dedicated to the Nsukka School. So as you enter this room, you'll hear the kind of voice, the reverberation of the voice of Christopher Okigbo, an extraordinary Nigerian poet who spent much of his career kind of contemplating the politics of nationhood and what it really meant for a writer, in his case, to kind of build a new form through poetry that would kind of embody, you could say, the possibilities of a new nation. Just before Christopher Okigbo died in the Nigerian Civil War, there was a very strong sense that many of his works were almost viewed as a kind of prophesizing of what was to come. He was evoking the language of the natural world, of thunder, to kind of symbolize the death and destruction that he saw as kind of an inevitability of rising ethnic tension. The Nigerian Civil War was, of course, a period of huge loss, particularly for the Igbo community, and I think a period that many artists reflect upon with a great sense of pain and anguish. And I think what was important to honor in this part of the exhibition is this kind of balancing of artists who were, yes, addressing the political situation, but also emerging into this kind of period of national reunification during a time where there were many scars, you could say, on the kind of national landscape of Nigerian identity. And I think that in this particular work by Obiora Duchukwu, titled Our Journey, you see his commitment to Igbo uli mark making, which is a form of indigenous practice, traditionally practiced by women in Nigeria for centuries, and had actually been appropriated by male artists in the 1970s as a means of reviving an abstract tradition that was very much associated with Igbo identity. And I think this is just an extraordinary example of how abstraction within the context of Igbo belief systems was very much a part of a living culture. It wasn't necessarily associated with Western ideas of abstraction. It was about artists coming to this through the indigenous language of uli mark making. So uli murals are traditionally created by women, as I mentioned before, as a form of mural making, but also as a form of body art. And in fact, many of the symbols associated with these marks, like the crescent moon or the spiral, are represented across a variety of works in this very room. But I think Our Journey is probably the most powerful and symbolic example of an artist pushing the abstract qualities of uli mark making to the very limit.
And on the opposing wall, we have a depiction of the uli mark and symbols from the facade of a wall or a building. And these have been taken from the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge, from the Northcote Whitridge Thomas collection. And like Osei said, it was really important to highlight the kind of women that were doing this at the turn of the century. These images were taken in 1911 and can be seen in dialogue with some of the artworks that are shown in this room.
Absolutely. And what's important to note is that when the campus of Nsukka reopened in the 1970s, many of these artists were still recovering from the traumas associated with the war, but it was under the influence of Uche Okeke, who is the main professor, the leader of the Nsukka Fine Art Department, that many of them began to revive Uli traditions. So Uche Okeke created this painting, Anamwo, Land of the Dead, in 1961, so well before the Civil War, but it actually evokes the kind of Igbo spiritual world associated with the Land of the Dead, and actually many of these sorts of figures that you see hovering through the landscape are directly correlate to Igbo Uli mark making. So there's a real sense that he embedded the idea of natural synthesis that he, of course, had developed as a student at the Zaria Art Society at NCAST, and elaborated it to introduce a new generation of artists and to encourage a new generation of artists to take up this new form of visual expression. And in the final wall in this room, you have a variety of artists who were really sort of inspired by the influence of Obiora Chukwu, but also of Uche Okeke, who at a certain point was still teaching at the university. And they include figures like Ndidi Dike, Taiwo Adenaike, Oluwaguibe, and Ada Udachukwu, all of whom you could say became the kind of second generation of artists to grapple with the abstract possibilities of Uli mark making. So we're very proud and excited to be able to present an intergenerational perspective of Nigerian art, really looking at the kind of lines of influence, but also these kind of shared dialogues, these shared political, artistic, and cultural commitments that I think are writ large across the exhibition. So we're now going to move into the final room of the exhibition, Painting in Darkness, which focuses on the artist Uzo Ogonu. So this room is a room that we're especially proud of. We managed to assemble an extraordinary array of artists, of works by one of Nigeria's most celebrated and yet, I think, overlooked artists at the same time. Uzo Ogonu is a figure who spent the majority of his career in the UK. He actually arrived in the UK shortly after the end of the Second World War, during a time of national reconstruction and during a time in which many Black British artists were contemplating this question of what did it mean to ask questions about their role within British society. And he joined the Black Arts movement and became associated with figures like Ronald Moody, the famed Caribbean artist living in Britain. But he also constantly felt this sense of longing for home, this longing for return. And I think that one of the things that really characterizes his practice is this embrace of the abstract qualities of Uli murals and Uli mark making, but kind of combined with these more abstract and more postmodern principles. He's working well into the 1980s, and he's fundamentally, as with his counterparts based in other parts of Nigeria, sort of synthesizing these different artistic traditions. And we decided to pair these two paintings for a specific reason. The painting on the bottom is titled Woman in Grief, which reveals this kind of fragmented body in the aftermath of war. It was painted in 1968 as a kind of reflection on the trauma associated with the Nigerian Civil War. And then a painting that was painted within a year of that, which is an image of Piccadilly Circus in London. And these two realities, these two spaces in which he was, the two environments that he was occupying, one in his imagination, because he of course didn't return to Nigeria until 1977, and the other, which was his everyday environment of probably catching the London bus into central London to go to Piccadilly Circus. So it's a real eye-opener in terms of how he was negotiating these various visual traditions. I think one of the last series that we'd really like to focus on is Stateless People. It's made up of a large body of works, but we've brought together three very significant examples from this series that was first unveiled at the South Bank Centre in London towards the end of the 1980s. And I don't know whether you want to say a few words about this series, Bilal, because it was a really important series of works to bring together, but a series of works that I think we were almost amazed by just the originality of what he was doing, but also how pioneering he was for what he was trying to say with this particular body of work.
Definitely, and you can really see his strong use of colour throughout the three paintings.
Absolutely.
And this idea that he's centering the individual. So we've got an artist here with a beret, we've got the poet and the poetess, And it's really contemplating ideas around belonging and nationhood and centering the individual that make up these kind of ideas of nation and nation states and what have you. And yeah, we're really excited to have brought these three works together for the first time since the 1980s.
Absolutely. And what's significant to say is that at the time, Osei Ogonu was grappling with his frustrations with the politics of nationhood. He was very critical about the political environment of Nigeria, but he also felt slightly resentful about the fact that he'd never been able to return, only for a short time during the Festec Festival of 1977. So in the 1980s, at a point where he's losing his eyesight, he creates one of his most vibrant and kind of politically charged series, Stateless People, where he's asking a question that I think is as resonant today about this sense of statelessness. What does it mean for an artist to refuse kind of national identity and to kind of pursue an artistic endeavor, you could say, against the grain of how they may feel about their connection to a particular nation? And I would say Osei Ogonu's expression of nationhood is rather unique within this exhibition, but it's one that I think speaks to an artist's right to pursue their own idea of independence. So when we talk about the development of independence in Nigeria, it's about political independence, but also about an artist's right to fashion their own independent visions of what Nigeria could be. And I think no artist has done that in a more bold and confrontational a way than Osei Ogonu. And I think to end the exhibition with this work was a way of really synthesizing so much of what artists are speaking to, which is this kind of significant drive towards creating a new image, a new vision of the nation in the aftermath of colonialism, but more importantly, I think, leading us into the 21st century. And of course, Osei Ogonu is an artist who sadly passed away in the 1990s, creating a path for a global diaspora of artists to emerge. And I think he was one of the first Nigerian artists living in the UK to then gain recognition that would, as I mentioned before, create a path for others to follow in his wake. So we're very proud to bring these works together. Thank you for following this tour, and please come to see Nigerian Modernism at Tate. It runs through May of 2026, and we hope you enjoy the exhibition. Thank you so much.